I'm Laurie Cardoza-Moore, and this is Focus on Israel. And welcome to Focus on Israel. I'm Laurie Cardoza-Moore, President and founder of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating and sharing the message of Christian biblical responsibility to the Jewish people and the land of Israel against the rise of global genocidal anti-Semitism. Today we're going to be looking into the controversy behind the settlements in Judea and Samaria. Do you know why this little piece of land, now incorrectly called the West Bank, has become a focal point of dispute and the center of the world's attention? To help you better understand the history and politics of the settlements, I'd like to show you a video piece produced by our friends at Stand With Us, a highly respected pro-Israel organization. It's hosted by Danny Ayalon, a former deputy foreign minister and Israeli ambassador to the U.S.
Often on the news, we hear the terms occupied territories, 67 borders, and illegal settlements. And the story we usually hear sounds very simple. During the Six-Day War, Israel captured the West Bank from the Palestinians, refused the United Nations' demand to retreat, and illegally built settlements. But is that really the case? Let's try to understand the situation a little bit better. We'll start with a simple but extremely important question. From whom did Israel capture the West Bank? From the Palestinians? No. In 1967, there was no Arab nation or state by the name of Palestine. Actually, was there ever? Israel took over the West Bank from Jordan in an act of self-defense, after Jordan joined a war launched by Egypt and Syria to destroy Israel. Oh, by the way, destroying countries is rather illegal. The United Nations back in 1967 rejected repeated Arab and Soviet attempts to declare Israel as the aggressor. Security Council Resolution 242 did not demand a unilateral Israeli withdrawal. Rather, the United Nations called for negotiating a solution which would leave Israel with secure and recognized boundaries. In effect, defensible borders. But wait a second. What was Jordan doing in the West Bank in the first place? What was its legal justification? Well, Jordan had It had no legal justification. Jordan simply occupied it during its previous attempt to destroy the newly established State of Israel in 1948, changing the commonly accepted name Judea and Samaria to the West Bank. But that did not really convince anybody. And almost no one recognized the legality of Jordan's occupation, not even any of the other Arab states. So, if Jordan had no legal claim to the land, and a Palestine did not exist, whose territory is it? Let's go a little further back in time. Don't worry, not to the days of the Bible, only about 100 years. Until 1917, the Ottoman Empire occupied the whole region. After losing in World War I, the Ottomans relinquished their 500-year control to the Allied forces, which decided to divide the old empire into countries. Britain's foreign minister, Lord Balfour, recognized the Jewish people's historical right to their homeland, a small area equivalent to about 0.5% of the Middle East was designated for this purpose. Britain received a mandate from the League of Nations to promote the establishment of a Jewish homeland. But wait a second, do you realize what happened? The Jewish homeland originally included not only the West Bank, but also the East Bank of the Jordan River. I guess you cannot say the Jewish people have not accepted some painful compromises already. Anyway, the League of Nations recognition of a Jewish homeland, which includes the West Bank, was reaffirmed by the United Nations after the Second World War. With the British mandate ending, United Nations General Assembly Resolution 181 recommended the establishment of two states, one Jewish and one Arab. The Jews accepted it and went on to create the State of Israel, while the Arabs refused the compromise and launched a war to destroy the newly established Jewish state. Resolution 181, a non-binding recommendation in the first place, remained with no legal standing. At the end of the war, a ceasefire line was formed, where the Israeli and Arab forces stopped fighting. At the insistence of the Arab leaders, this line was defined as having no political significance. So, although this line is commonly referred to as the 1967 border, it is not from 1967, and it was never an international border. Israel's presence in the West Bank is the result of a war of self-defense. The West Bank should not be considered occupied because there was no previous legal sovereign in the area, and therefore, the real definition should be disputed territory. The 1947 partition plan has no current legal standing, while Israel's claim to the land was clearly recognized by the international community during the 20th century. That is why the presence and construction of Israeli settlements in the West Bank should not be considered illegal. These are not just my own opinions. They are based on conclusions made by world-renowned jurists like Professor Eugene Rastow, Justice Arthur Goldberg, and Stephen Schwebel, who headed the International Court of Justice. So what's the solution for the dispute over the West Bank? Unfortunately, there is no magic solution. But the only way a solution will ever be reached is if we base our negotiations on legal and historical facts. So please, let's stop using the terms occupied territories and 67 borders. They're simply not politically correct.
I pray you were enlightened and hopefully a bit entertained by that well-made documentary cartoon. I now have a rare treat coming up next, a talk with an actual resident of Judea and Samaria, Eve Harrow. Eve moved to Efrat after earning a master's in psychology. Her pro-Israel activity began in her native Los Angeles and has only deepened with her life's connection to Israel. Since the early 90s, she has made an impact as a passionate spokesperson of the right of Jews to live in this part of their ancient homeland. Eve presently hosts a weekly radio show on Israel National Radio with a global audience of Jews and non-Jews alike.
My name is Eve Harrow. I live in Efrat, which is in Gush Etzion, the Etzion block between Bethlehem and Hebron. I am married. I have 7 children and 4th grandchild on the way. And what I do mainly for these children and these grandchildren is I'm a passionate advocate of the right of Jews to live in all parts of the land of Israel. I've been doing that pretty much since we moved here in 1988. I have a master's degree in psychology, but I ended up really focusing on this because I saw that the truth is just not making its way out there. And the lives that we were leading, the so-called settlers who are the big obstacles to everything, were not at all quite the opposite. And so I've really devoted my life right now to trying to get the word out. And I'm also a tour guide through the Israel Ministry of Tourism, which gives me an opportunity to go all through Israel with people and show them the country and how beautiful it is. And never has someone left disappointed, ever. The British mandate for Palestine was all of what's Israel today, and Judea and Samaria, and the entire country of Jordan. And that's where the Jews were supposed to have a homeland, and the world had accepted that and had agreed with that. Balfour Declaration, San Remo Conference, a lot of history in there. And then slowly, the Jews were given less and less and less until the 1947 partition plan from the UN, which gave the Jews a part on the coast and gave another section over to, really wasn't clear to whom, and Jerusalem and Bethlehem was going to be internationalized. The Jews accepted this plan, even though it was almost impossible to defend, but this is 3 years after World War II, and we needed a place for Jews to be safe. And the Arabs didn't, and 7 Arab armies attacked this fledgling Jewish state. at the end of which Israel was born, 1948, the State of Israel was born. What is very interesting is that when the Arabs talk about the Nakba, when they talk about the catastrophe, they talk about 1948. So even though some people want to believe that they're just upset about the later war of 1967, which is when Israel was able to liberate Judea and Samaria, they're really talking about the creation of the state. And that's ultimately the essence of the problem. The problem that we have now is not a territorial issue. It's an inability on the part of the Arab world, and I use the word Arab loosely, okay, the Islamic Arab world, to accept any Jewish entity in its midst whatsoever. It has nothing to do with the borders and the territory. The Jews were ethnically cleansed from the area known as Judea and Samaria. It's the biblical heartland. It's Hebron, it's Shiloh, it's Bethlehem. It's all these places where the Jewish nation was born. And we were thrown out, and no one was allowed to live between 48 and 67, including the eastern part of Jerusalem. And even though Arabs were living in Israel, 20% of Israelis are Arabs with citizenship, but no Jews were allowed to live in these areas. And of course were killed and their homes were taken over. In 1967, in a war that can only be described as a total miracle, in 6 days, Israel liberated the Sinai and the Golan Heights and Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem from Jordan, who had illegally occupied it, even though Israel asked them not to enter the war. And then Jews started to go home. Israel offered for peace to give the land back right away in exchange for peace, except for Jerusalem. In the Arab world, the Khartoum Conference said no to peace, no to recognition, no to negotiation. So Jewish Israelis, some of whom had been born in these areas, said, well, we want to go home, and reestablished communities, and new communities were established, and old communities were reestablished in Judea and Samaria. And now something like 10% of all Israelis live in areas where the world would consider us settlers, in areas that didn't belong to Israel officially before 1967. And I'm proud to include myself as one of them. And these are areas now that unfortunately many on the Israeli left and many Arabs have convinced the world that this is the reason why Israel is hated. Because we took their land in 1967, therefore they hate us, and such is born land for peace. Which made sense to a lot of Israelis. We hate being hated. Like, are we really so bad? So if there's a logical reason why we're hated, okay, we don't agree with it. We know that it wasn't their land. Jordan had occupied it. But if that's what they think, and we really desperately want peace, but it turns out that it's not land for peace because the problem isn't about land. And in response, we haven't gotten anywhere near the peace. And so when people talk about a two-state solution, they're essentially saying that Israel will go back to the borders that we had between 48 and 67. And Judea and Samaria, and quite possibly Jerusalem and all its holy sites as well, will be formed a so-called Palestinian state, which we know will be an enemy state of Israel. We've had the preview in Gaza, and one of the things that bothers me so much is that we don't listen to the other side. The West, Jews and Christians, we talk to ourselves because we have the same ethos, we have the same mindset, democracy, freedom of speech, those kinds of the Judeo-Christian mores of which we're so proud. But the other side is saying very clearly that peace is not what we say it is, and that they must destroy and they must take it over, Dar al-Islam, for the glory of Islam, and we're not listening to them. And I think that if those of us who haven't learned from World War II or even before that rhetoric married to power is very dangerous. It's not just somebody mouthing off. If he's got the power to do what he's saying, you better take him very, very seriously. And it frustrates me that in our desire, almost messianic desire, sometimes I look at the people on the left and I'm like, wow, they're messianic. This Oslo, this peace process has totally taken over any rationality that they have. And it's the emperor's not wearing any clothes. There is no one here to talk to about the peace that I learned in 11th grade or whatever it was, the kind of Western peace that we talk about. And that really frightens me. We're not dealing with reality, and the price that we're going to pay is going to be very, very high.
Now I'd like to introduce you to some new friends of ours who live in the beautiful hills of Samaria. Moshe and Leah Goldsmith made Aliyah to Israel in 1985, and like the pioneers of old who left the safety of established civilization and set their roots in new territory, they helped establish a settlement that has grown into the vibrant town of Itamar.
That it's such a simple thing. The whole story of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel is testified within the Bible. And if someone is a Bible believer and believes the Bible, we know that there are 2.2 billion Christians in the world today. And the world, it's a consensus, a world consensus that accepts the Bible as the most, I would say, the best-selling document about what's going on in Israel today. And if you look in the Bible, the center of the land of Israel really is the places where we as the pioneers of Israel today. So we feel, again, as there's no one has more right to the land than the Jewish people. That God is calling us back. If we read the prophets, we see how the prophets talk about the promise that God will return the people to the land of Israel. And after 2,000 years of exile, we see prophecy coming true. We see how we returned to our precious homeland. And that's where we live. We live in the place of Itamar. It's a beautiful town. And we are situated in the center of the Bible Belt of the land of Israel. But we find it so funny how the world looks at Itamar and these pioneering communities as the obstacle to world peace, where we believe we are fulfilling prophecy and returning to God's land. It's such a strange thing in our eyes. But again, that's where I began my journey, in a home, an Orthodox home, studying about Israel. Finally, we graduated college. We moved to Israel. We were only 21 years old, 1985, and we were wandering about for a year looking for a place to live. And then we said to ourselves, we want to do something more idealistic. And we came to the land, and we joined a new nucleus that was forming a community in Judea and Samaria, in a place called, again, Itamar. And at that time, there was only 10 families living there. We had no electricity. We had to rely on a generator. We had to rely on, there were dirt roads leading to the community. It was just, I guess, coming over and setting up tent on these hilltops, which we've turned over the years, the last 27 years, into a beautiful, thriving community where we live today, in Samaria.
We live in an amazing generation, as they say in Hebrew, Mishiabud Legeula. It's the generation of the end of the exile and the beginning of the redemption. And in the merit of righteous Gentiles, my father was saved during the Holocaust. He eventually made his way to America, met my mom, and growing up, I would go with him to hear him speak about his experience in the Holocaust, which made me always feel, as far as my identity was concerned, although I was growing up in the 70s, rock and roll and teens, that 70s show, that whole life as a regular American, but something in the back of my mind always said, this is not totally your identity. But being a child, you can't really rationalize that. Coupled with, of course, Bible study. And when I would learn about Joseph and Rachel with the flock and the forefathers walking on the land, it definitely sparked something in me. God definitely kindled something in me. And that spark really ignited completely when my husband and I met again. After not seeing each other for about 7-8 years, we had already been young adults, and the first words we said to each other were, Israel. We were stepping out of the norm and saying, we want to go live in the land, like it says in the Bible. And that was a little outrageous. Our wedding was the goodbye party to our families and our friends, and, we set out, as God said to Abraham, get thee to the land I will show you. We really didn't know where we were going. I mean, we knew we were going to Israel, but we didn't know where. And, we traveled around, and as soon as we came to the heart of Israel, which in those days was not a populated area at all, we fell in love. We were looking at Joseph, Gideon, Abraham. In every direction, we were seeing the Bible. And for me personally, it was kind of like the prophecy of Ezekiel about the valley of the dry bones, because my identity was connected more to my aunts and uncles that were killed in the Holocaust and that vision of those bones. But suddenly those bones made a great noise. And that was the great noise of us walking on the land. It's been an amazing testimony to see the land turn from gray to green, and to actually live in the generation of the land coming back to life. It's been amazing.
The biblical significance of our area Itamar is that it's really the first place that Abraham made his way to when he came into the land of Israel. As we all know, if you read your Bible stories, Abraham came from Mesopotamia, and he was told by God to leave his homeland, leave his father's house and go to the land that I will show you. That was one of his tests. We say that Abraham was tested with 10 different trials, and one of them was going to a land, think about it, not knowing where you're going to. And well, anyway, Abraham makes his way along the beautiful valleys leading to something called the Yabok crossing, the Jabbok crossing mentioned in the Bible, as we know, that ancient route through Jacob, who took that same route when he wrestled with the angel. And he comes across that crossing, which crosses over the Jordan River as well, and makes his way up the mountain. And when he makes his way up the mountain, where does he reach? He comes to a place called the Shechem. It says, Vayavo in Hebrew, Vayavo Avram ba'aretz ad mekom Shechem ad Elon Moreh. And Abraham comes to the land, to the place of Shechem, Elon Moreh. And that's really the backyard of our hometown, Itamar. So these historical prophecies came true in our backyard. And that's why it's so meaningful to us, living there.
If you could visualize the map of Israel, so we have the Jordan running on the east, and we have the coast on the west. Pretty small country, the size of New Jersey. But right in the center of that country comes up like a cone, a mountainous area running up and down. And that's the heartland of Israel. That's what the world calls a different place. The world calls it the West Bank. But I'll review the vertebrae on that spinal cord running up and down. And it starts with Shechem, the land of Joseph, going south to Shiloh, where the tabernacle stood for 400 years almost, running a little more south to Beit El, where Jacob had the dream, the ladder. South to Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, where the Holy Temple stood, and we hope one day to rebuild our Holy Temple. Running a little more south, Bethlehem, the resting place of Rachel, and Hebron, where the patriarchs and matriarchs are buried. So you're talking about the spinal cord. Now we know that each vertebrae holds in an inner organ, and where we live, the inner organ is the heart. When someone sends me a letter, it says, to the heart of Israel. That's my address, Lev HaShomron. You can't pull a heart out of a body, because if you do that, the body won't live. So this is our life force. This is where all of the life force comes out to the world, actually, from the heartland of Israel.
Someone who has made it his mission to help the Jews of Judea and Samaria is Tommy Waller. He is the founder and executive director of Harrow, the only international humanitarian organization supporting farming and archaeological programs in Judea and Samaria. Each year, Harrow brings a growing number of volunteers to the biblical heartland to serve local farmers. Tommy explains the strategic need for Israel to keep this piece of property that God promised to the Jewish people thousands of years ago.
The first settlements began back in the 1800s. You know, they had they started the whole settlement movement. But after 1967, and the war, the 6-Day War, we got access again to the mountains of Israel, what we were talking about. But it was they were slow. People weren't just running to the mountains and trying to set up a town, just claiming their land. You'd think, after 1967, everybody, wow, what a miracle. And we'll just run and go settle these mountains and take back the land that God promised us through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What happened is that they were lazy, and I say that in a good way, but they were slow. Everybody was happy doing what they were doing in their own town, whether it was Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem or outside the Green Line. They were happy, but something happened. 1973, the Yom Kippur War, and that war got Israel's attention. And because in 1967, after 1967, Israel began to think that it was undefeated. I mean, we couldn't be beat. We were invincible. Nothing could happen to us. And we didn't have anything to worry about. We'll take the land when we get ready to take the land. But nobody was doing it. Nobody was really pushing it. But in 1973, the war was totally different. It was, Israel almost lost that war. And that would have been devastating to Israel, to the whole nation. Syria was coming in And it happened on the holiest day of the year, the Yom Kippur. Nobody was ready for it, and they had to scramble. And it was just they eked out a victory. I mean, literally through a miracle. It was a miracle, but it wasn't in 6 days. They lost a lot of people. After that, the people of Israel said, "Well, wait a minute. We can't wait on this night on settling these mountains. We have to go now." And that initiated the drive with several people to go into these mountains, and they began to settle the communities. And it was a blessing, as it turns out. It was a serious blessing, because these people began to throw up tents. They began to settle on in these places and develop these little communities. And because they developed the communities, what happened later, especially under the Clinton administration, they developed the Oslo Accords. And so because of the growth of the settlement movement in the late 70s and in the 80s, early 80s, and then through the 80s, the Oslo Accord, when they came in, if they had not established those communities when they did, the Oslo Accord would immediately granted the Palestinians a state right away.
A popular saying today is, "What would Jesus do?" Or even, "What would Jesus say?" In Acts 1:8, just before he rose to be with the Father, Jesus said, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." So if we as Christians really want to do and say what Jesus did, then we should never again call this disputed piece of land the West Bank. That is the term used by the opposition. Well, that's our show for today. And I hope I've made it clear that the time to stand up is now. Be a leader in your community and in your church. One person can make a difference. Get involved with and support pro-Israel organizations such as PJTN. Call your elected officials. Let your leaders hear from you. Visit our website to learn more and sign up to receive free newsletters and action alerts. God bless you. We'll see you next time on Focus on Israel.
To support this program, send your tax-deductible gift to Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, P.O. Box 682711, Franklin, Tennessee 37068. You can also support PJTN online. Visit pjtn.org or call 1-877-873-9020.
Anti-Semitism has reached epic proportions, and Israel is now surrounded by nations who seek its destruction. For Israel to lose just one battle would mean losing everything. As Christians, it is our biblical responsibility to stand with our Jewish brethren and Israel. PJTN needs your help to reach more Christians with this urgent message. Please visit our website to become a member today and order our award-winning documentaries. You must decide that you won't be silent. Sign up now at pjtn.org. God bless you, and thank you for your support and prayers.